Next speaker is Matt Sipe. He's currently the guy that everybody wants to talk to. He's responsible for the open system architecture for PEO Aviation. I've heard Matt talk a couple times here within the last week. Everybody wants to hear what he's got to say, but it's an idea of where you need to be in a program looking ahead going forward. So Matt.
We, not to interrupt, but we do still have a couple virtual or questions posed through the webinar platform for the last speaker. So we could go over those, or we could move to the next speaker, and I can email the previous.
Yeah, we'll just go ahead and email the questions to John. And
okay. Understood.
Slides. Okay. So good morning, Matt Sipe, PEO Aviation, Director of MOSA Transformation. Yes, I've given this briefing a lot of times, or parts of this briefing a lot of times, so I'm probably going to skip through the first couple of slides pretty quickly, because I really do want to get to the meat of the discussion today on the kind of the digital environment and the digital ecosystem. Next slide. So this is our standard. What is MOSA and why now? So most of you in the room probably are aware MOSA is certainly a technical thing and a business thing. And realistically, MOSA does not work unless you have both of those aspects. So that's really what I'm kind of harder to go do as an office, is to that technical and business strategy for all PEO Aviation so that we can become a more MOSA-centric organization. But the other thing I like to use this chart for is talk about kind of the why now. And so if this is not obvious to everyone, now it will be, is that we're at this extremely unique inflection point in time, right? If you're not aware, that the thread is moving kind of fast, and quite frankly, we're having trouble keeping up at times. Just listened to a brief last week of the Air Force briefing about what China is doing relative to their programs, and they're having trouble keeping up, right? So we have to do something differently if we're going to keep up with the pace of the threat. And with that also goes the pace of technology. You see technology keep moving faster and faster, and as good Americans, we want to provide the best capability to our soldiers, right? So we need to be able to insert such capability and technology into our platforms. Last two bullets there, also relative to why now, is affordability. It's kind of a big deal across all the services. I mean, if you're tracking DoD budgets, they're not on this great incline, and now without having a lot of OCO dollars, things are just different. We've got to react to that and procure and acquire things in a different manner. All right, and then the last bullet there is we have a unique space and time relative to a lot of future vertical lift, whether that's the two FVL platforms, FAR and FLAR, or FTUAS or ALE. All these new programs coming online, it provides a very unique opportunity for us to say, hey, how do we do something different and also not leave the enduring fleet, right? Because the enduring fleet is going to be out there for a long, long time. All right, so a unique inflection point. Off to the right-hand side, I've got the MOSA objectives. These really aren't that different than any set of MOSA objectives now, but when it comes down to it, it's really enabling us to engage differently throughout the entire aviation. That's some of the value that we're going to bring from a MOSA perspective. So next slide. All right, so this is again one of those standard. This is the general officer chart, the single chart that we briefed everybody. So what's driving MOSA transformation? It's really all about aligning people, processes, and tools so that we can again become a more MOSA-centric organization. And so what we looked back and we saw, said, hey, there's lots of awesome things occurring in the kind of current state of things, and that's both in industry. So a lot of what your companies are doing, you're watching and taking note of. We also had a very robust S&T program with JMR and MSAT and those types of efforts that were really doing a lot of great work to figure out how we should do things differently. So present a lot of great ideas. And so as a PEO responsible for acquiring things, we need to not just watch those good ideas and watch what industries do. We actually need to change how we do business to leverage those things. So that's really what my 9 LE's lines of efforts are all about, is changing how we do business internally. So again, this is not just technical, it's also business side things. But for today, I really want to focus on the fourth line there, the collective or collaborative digital environment or digital ecosystem, digital engineering, any of those words you want to talk about, and kind of focus on just what I've seen from my perspective. Again, this is just Matt's perspective of DE. So let's go ahead and jump to the next slide, and I'll kind of hang out there for a little bit. All right, so number one, I do not own DE. Lars Erickson, who will be briefing later, he owns DE for PO Aviation. So we, within the MOSA office, we leverage that digital ecosystem environment, that set of digital tools to hopefully do our job better, right? And so I've kind of listed here just on the chart, some of those tools. This is not an all-inclusive list, but some of those tools and how we are using them. So from a kind of a Cameo EA perspective, or using SysML as a language, that's certainly something that we leverage for building out family of systems architectures and models, to modeling requirements and what we would call component spec models. And then you kind of get over into the face side of the house, where we use UDDL, which is Unified Data Design Logic. Can't remember what the other D was. Anyways, but we use that for the face data modeling, and then convert it over to SysML. Right, and then our conformance and integration evaluations, that will be part of our conformance program for MOSA. We will also be heavily leveraging those SysML models. I can step back. So it's not just look at the so we're not using just those models to do initial work, but we're actually using those to make our evaluations, right? To verify that all those interfaces are actually the interfaces that are important to us and they've been identified appropriately. Right, and then you get into kind of the PLM side of the house, which, quite frankly, we're kind of immature on looking at that side of the house from a MOSA TO perspective, but we know it's absolutely critical to where we want to go from a MOSA perspective long term, right? Because it gets into product line management. You really can't do product line management or product lifecycle engineering if you don't have good management of your TDP across the enterprise, not just with a single platform. It's also using things like Git and Bitbucket for software configuration management as well. And then really interesting to me, and I like these kinds of tools, are the kind of work efficiency tools, whether it be Confluence, Jira, or any of the others. I think that is a big part of us getting more and more into the digital ecosystem, and it will impact how we do our daily work. So I'll make one quick note on that. For me, these tools have got to be adopted to a level that, they're just like Outlook. Like when we all show up to work every day, like if Outlook's not already up, you open Outlook, right? We've got to get to the place where whatever the tools are that you're responsible for using are just that normal part of business for you and your office. And so I used to be a airworthiness engineering director guy, now SRD. And at that point, it was Outlook, it was TTS every day. That stayed up on my screen the entire day, and that's how I did work. Now then, PO Aviation, I don't think we're quite there yet, right? And part of that is we've got a learning process to go through, but we've also got to figure out how to best leverage those tools. So that's kind of what I talk about on the DE challenges and benefits. Again, Matt's perspective on the world is from a challenge perspective. As we start to use these tools, it's changing our workflows. It's changing how we use those tools to get our job done. And we all saw that when we went from non-telework to telework, right? Like if you couldn't figure out how to use Teams, like you're behind, right? You are not going to be efficient at doing your job. And so the same thing goes with a lot of these other tools. If you can't figure out how to use these tools, then you're going to end up being left behind at some point, because that's just where we're headed, right? And so we've got to figure out what those new norms are and how to implement those across PO Aviation. Next one there is consistent representation of data across the enterprise, right? So anybody who's done anything with auto-based systems engineering or using any MBSE tool out there, you would realize that, hey, if I give the same project to any two different groups, I'm probably going to get two different sets of models, and they may or may not interoperate together, right? So that's a problem that we've got to solve with good, robust processes and training. Next one, there's conversion of existing information into consumable digital forms, and so we do need to migrate from paper to digital things, but that is still not using digital tools necessarily. Just because you make it digital doesn't mean you're actually leveraging the digital ecosystem. And so all of our enduring platforms, that's how they've done business for decades. At some point, that transition has got to occur. How that's going to occur, we'll see, and when, we'll see. But that's an important step that has to be tackled. The last one there is knowledge or data creep for decision making. And And really what I mean there is we've also got to be careful that we understand when enough information is enough information, right? As we get more and more into this digital environment, there's lots and lots of data. There's going to be a natural tendency to say, well, there's still more. There's still more. Give me more data, and I'm not ready to make a decision. And so we, as leaders, managers of those kinds of organizations, have got to figure out when is enough data for us to be able to make a decision. And part of that is how we represent said data in whatever tool that we have. So those are just some of the key challenges. There's another huge one, and that's the training and talent aspect of this. But we have a panel this afternoon that will talk more on that as well. But those are the DE challenges. Now benefits. So I'm a huge fan of these tools in this environment and migrating us as an entire organization into this ecosystem. One, because I believe it will cause us to get back to good systems engineering, right? And I'll caveat the statement, just because you use an MBSE tool does not mean you're a good SE. We've seen that plenty of times. And so we got to be careful that we don't go and just hire modelers, because that may not be the systems engineering that you have. So I think it's going to help us get back to better systems engineering if we have the right processes in place as we use these tools. Next one, there's reduced learning curve for new employees. So it's not necessarily that the curve comes down or the amount of knowledge comes down. It's just that I think they get through the curve much quicker, right? Because, and I've seen this several times, trying to onboard people to a new office, you could have a senior engineer with many, many years of systems engineering experience and will struggle to get fully on board everything because they're trying to read through all these paper documents everywhere. But at the same time, I could go hire a very junior person straight out of college and have them start to model this or model the. Yep. Oh, yeah. Got a hot mic for somebody online. Your eyes, you see. Yeah, we have. Jim. Hot mic. Hey, Chris, I think somebody's got a hot mic. All right,
what was that? Hot mic? Okay.
Thanks.
Sorry, I thought that those were sounds coming from the presentation room. I'll go ahead and mute.
Okay, thanks. Okay, so again, I could take a rather new engineer straight out of college, and as they start using tools like MBSE tools, they can quickly start to see all those connections, right? And part of it's just because a lot of us are more visual learners than anything else, and so as you start to see those, and as you interact with the system, I've just personally seen that those younger engineers very quickly come up the learning curve, and quickly they can outpace even some of the more senior engineers, right? I also think it's a very good opportunity to do on-the-job training, right? So I can take a very senior engineer who may know nothing about SysML, and I can have them sit with a rather junior person, and suddenly they're able to have that knowledge transfer occur. So I think we've got to leverage that as well, and it's kind of make some of that succession training occur quickly. Next one is better understanding of our systems, or at least the critical data, right? And so largely I see on the PO Aviation side, this is where there's a lot of opportunity for improvement, right? To really understand how our systems operate. As Dr. Lewis knows, there's, complex systems has been a big problem for aviation industry for a long time. So we have to figure out ways to make a complex system much less complex. And as we leverage these tools, that is a mechanism in which we can start to do essentially have separation of concerns exist. So now I can say, I understand this thing and how it interacts with everything else around it. Therefore, I can treat it differently. I can almost treat it like a federated system and make it more simplistic. So excited to see D kind of bring that benefit as well. Additionally, it helps us scope integration efforts, right? So one of the biggest cost drivers for integration efforts is we don't understand truly how that thing integrates into the rest of the system. So there's a lot of unknowns or supposed unknown systems. So that, of course, drives cost and schedule and all those things, right? So that's the other big piece. Next one there is the ability to not wait for procedurals to gain. right? And so really the last two here are tied together of not duplicating industry efforts to share information. And so what I mean there, we've already talked about a little bit this morning, is hopefully we can get to the point with these tools and these environments where it's a little bit more real-time access to status of the design, status of the system. So, hey, I just want you to give me a one of these MBSE drops versus waiting for a Seadrill to come across my desk, or at the same time not duplicating effort, because if you as industry are doing all your work within a certain tool, well, just give us a drop of that data set versus putting it in some paper form and then delivering it to us, because you don't use the paper, right? Even in your own PLM systems, you're not working off of paper. You've got it managed separately, and that's how you're treating all of your product lines. We probably ought to do the same on our side and not force you to do something completely different just to meet our specific needs. So I think there's a lot of potential benefits to be had there. Where that line is, I don't know. It's not where it is today, though. I mean, it's going to be different than what it looks like today. So I think there's lots of benefits. And then I'll just touch on one other point that I didn't put on there. I think, especially as we all have to realize that there's a workforce that is generally aging, right? And that we're going to continue to lose a lot of the workforce because everybody's retirement eligible all of a sudden. And so we've got to backfill that big bathtub that we've all been talking about for over a decade now, with new engineers. And the new engineers are more excited about using a digital tool or showing up that they want them a stack of papers or some big folder. Like most of us were when we came to that new job. It was, hey, here's this big binder of information, start reading. And then you sat at your desk for the next 3 weeks while you're waiting on your computer to show up, reading a big binder, right? And so I think we can move beyond that, and that'll actually help us onboard people much quicker. All right, last chart. And so this, let me caveat this. This is some real-time kind of behind-the-scenes draft work that we're doing. I want to give folks just an idea of what we're doing relative to our enterprise architecture efforts. And so for those who are familiar with the FAF, this is not all that different than the FAF. This is really just kind of the next step to take. And so so I'll just kind of lay out real quick what this is, and then I'll stop and I'll take any questions. You know, at a high level, what we all realize that we've seen with the FAF is you do need to have a robust framework for any kind of architecture work that you want to do. So we're going to have what we're calling an EAF. That's really about organizational context and processes, and it's going to be just a framework. And then we're going to likely have a enterprise level architecture that, you know, of course you can read the chart, but it has a certain level of supporting artifacts for it. It has these non-functional RAs, so you can think about that like FACE technical standard. That is really a non-functional RA that would influence what the end architecture ends up looking like. And then you have these capability reference architectures, like AT&T has a reference architecture, SCI will have a reference architecture, also influencing the architecture. And then you have operational requirements, of course, that feed in. And so the key thing that at the EA level that we end up with is product or functional architecture. So in industry, you might call that, you know, product line architecture, maybe. Right, but it's essentially taking all those missions and capabilities, decomposing them into functions, and then as an enterprise, starting to make decisions about how we group things, right? So we can then say, hey, across PO Aviation, we all need to group these things more similarly, especially in the areas that really matter to us, or the areas that are the key touch points, the things we all should share, and the things that cause us the most headache, right? And so we will document those at that level. And then out of that, you know, you could flow some sort of an objective type architecture or a family of systems architecture, but ultimately what we really want to get to is that architecture that is actually the thing that goes on contract with vendors. And then systems architecture flows over to the vendor. The vendor says, yep, got it, understand the requirements, or no, hey, you need to update these with some additional requirements. And then they come back with, well, a lot of people need a solutions architecture. And so that's kind of where we're headed as an organization. Again, this is not the final product. This is kind of what the current state of the idea is of where we're headed. But I think you'll start to see us push more and more of this information out in public forums in the near future. So with that, I've got 1 minute, 30 seconds left according to Dr. Lewis's clock. So I will take any questions.
Hey, Matt, with regard to the open group, where does MOSA fit in that construct? you're talking a lot about open group type items like FACE and SOSA, and those kind of, this, in that same direction with a standardized framework is kind of iteration one? Or?
It could. I'm not sure it'll be with Open Group. So part of my office is also involved with FACE, and so I have certainly touch points there. The key area for collaborations, I mean, that's really what Open Group enables, collaboration, is going to continue to be with the ACWA, Architecture Collaboration Working Group. So you'll see that in the next months, next year, start to take more and more of an enduring fleet inclusive flavor, whereas previously it was just FTO and a little bit of UAS stuff. It'll start being more enterprise, just like we're headed here, right? Because ideally what we don't want to see happen is decisions that get made that preclude others, or if they are made that way, it should be a decision point for us to say, hey, is it worth precluding the others to get, whatever, some certain decision.
Okay, so tied in, but maybe not necessarily taking the same path as some of the other standards. Okay.
Yep.
Thanks.
Other questions for Matt?
I had one, Matt. So, there's a lot of layers of decisions that you highlighted in one of your charts. And so I was wondering how the program and the digital, thread is managing those decisions related to architecture decisions, program decisions, families of systems decisions, product line decisions, modular open systems, approach decisions. So how's that getting managed at an enterprise level?
Yeah, so it's sort of a couple of avenues. One is we do have enterprise level policy. We also have implementation guidance to generally get folks headed down the right direction. But really where the rubber meets the road is through having an architecture framework and having the right governance and processes in place so that as decisions are about to be made by any individual PM, there's a checkpoint, right? That's what we've liked in the past is, every 06 PM is chartered individually. And so there really is no enterprise checkpoint for them. This helps create that checkpoint, that kind of baseline functional architecture for us to start bouncing things off of and say, hey, PM, whoever, you're about to make a decision relative to something that's documented in the enterprise architecture. Is that deviation point acceptable or not? Right. Hopefully that helps answer part of your question.
Definitely. Thanks, Matt.
Thanks, Matt.
Yep.
Hey, Matt, thanks a lot for coming in. Appreciate it. Hey, a lot of these things don't get done if you don't have good support from leadership. And I'm here to tell you, when I started this trying to pull this whole thing together, Pat Mason was a big supporter. I think well, first of all, he's a pretty big geek. So he enjoys this kind of stuff. But he also, thinks that this is really important to happen for the future, not only of Army aviation, but of acquisition.